Hello, everyone. Welcome to Directions Live Online. Now, today, I'm actually going to hand across to my colleague, Simon Jackson, who will be hosting our session today. Thanks, Simon.
Cheers, Laura. Good day, everyone on the call. One of my roles at Esri Australia is to help collate the various Australian data sets that are out there and ingest them into the various Esri content services. Now, Esri Basemaps are being used increasingly as the default choice by organisations within Australia. We look at the basemap usage stats and we can see that every month the hits purely from within Australia, these are growing, each month receiving over 1 billion requests, not only from the range of public-facing apps that use these basemaps, but also from your own projects and applications, be it in ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Enterprise, or ArcGIS Online. Now, for the session today, I'm very happy to have Seth dialing in from California to talk us through the Community Maps program. The world needs great basemaps. This has been Seth's mantra since the beginning of his career. For the last 24 years, he has listened to and followed this quest to power the world with basemaps. This journey has landed Seth as the team lead, building and maintaining Esri's basemaps as part of the larger ArcGIS Living Atlas. Seth and his team have helped a lot with getting great Australian content synchronized and registered into the Esri basemaps. Welcome to Directions Live Online, Seth. I'll pass it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you to the Esri Australia team for inviting me to the Directions Live webinar. I'm also thankful for the audience that's joined us. That's a great intro, Simon. And you're right. I've got a passion for basemaps, and I've been at Esri for over 14 years. And over 10 of those years, I've been working in the basemaps department of Esri, and it's been very enjoyable, and I've got to do a lot of interesting things, particularly this new program, or this program we've had at Esri called the Community Maps program, and it's centered around the basemaps. And I want to go ahead and give you a little backstory on this program. And then, hopefully this will lay the foundation of what we're talking about today. So the Community Maps program actually started around the same time that ArcGIS Online was actually launched. And this was around 2007, 2008. And many of the GIS users, ArcGIS users, would zoom into their hometowns or their place of work or their neighborhoods, and they would notice that in the base maps that were live at the moment, there might have been some missing content. There might have been the new neighborhood across the street wasn't there yet, or the new park that was built wasn't included in the map. And many of our organizations at that time started to reach out to Esri and started to say, hey, could you guys just add this shapefile in or add this layer in? And it became such a trend that we kind of formalized it. And so the world topographic map was kind of our primary base map at the beginning of the program, but we've kind of evolved a little bit. And over time, we started to collect this data and improve parts of the map. And really the term community came from the ArcGIS community, the users of Esri software and how they're using it to maintain interesting data about their areas, their own local data. And so we had a lot of situations where the before and after pictures of our base map have been dramatically increased, the detail and the level of precision. And that's kind of been the trend. And so that's really how the program has started. Now, this is a question I get pretty often. It's why do I contribute? Why would I do this? It's kind of an interesting question, and I usually think that's why it's great to start with. Now, your organization might use Esri's base maps today. And again, like Simon said, there's growing use of these maps. There's more applications that are consuming them. There's more professionals that are using them with desktop. But one of the main ingredients of this is that they're important to you and your citizens or your customers. And so that's a number one reason why to get involved. you might have tried to use Esri's basemaps in the past, and maybe you found some limitations. Maybe the data wasn't quite up to par or wasn't quite complete. And so that might have been a limitation. And ultimately, today's basemap, the current basemap, might have some limited information. There might be missing content. There might be some errors, in improper admin lines or those type of things that might be in the map. And the key here is that you have better data and you want to contribute that. So let's talk about what you can kind of contribute. So the program has kind of got a series of communities. So we like to, the number one that we talk about is the community maps for basemaps. And what we talk about there is actually what Simon mentioned, is adding content into the basemaps from local organizations. These could be park polygons, they could be building footprints, they could be administrative lines that are actually more accurate and more up to date with the changing world. They could be detailed campus type features that just add that second degree of precision and accuracy to the maps. So basemaps is a primary community. Another is imagery. Now, the World Imagery Basemap is probably one of the most popular maps in ArcGIS. Lots of people like to have the imagery map as a background. And just like the basemap started, people wanted to contribute their imagery. They had more up-to-date imagery, or the imagery might have been just at a better resolution, much more detailed information. And so the community maps for imagery accepts the actual raster information and sews the rasters into the World Imagery Basemap. We also have another community that started just a couple years ago that's called Community Maps for Addresses. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the base map so much. It really has to do with the geocoding capability within ArcGIS. And if that's an important factor, which many of our organizations find is very important, then improving that address system is an important factor for internally, maybe, or even to customers. And so we're looking for point address addresses, being able to pinpoint something right onto a building. And lastly, the final community is our elevation. And these is really where we're taking digital elevation models and integrating them into a global, almost like a mosaic of digital elevation models that support the scene viewer, if you've ever used that, kind of the 3D background, world hill shade, and then some other terrain-based layers that are in the living atlas of the world. Now, from the beginning of community maps, many years ago, the goal has always been the same. It's using the community's data and participation to improve these services. And I've always had this, I've seen this trend with base maps and some of these layers, these foundational layers, that as you have better base maps, you can make better maps and applications. When you have better maps and applications, you can have better results. You can communicate better. You can share your information better. So it's kind of that trend. So I kind of mentioned before, the program has become a little more formal. It is, we have a website. This is our landing page, communitymaps.arcgis.com. I like to call this our bubble page because we have our 3 bubbles, and those are really the 3 pathways for contributing or participating in this and making those systems better. And I'll talk about each one individually and then even a demonstration at the end. But providing feedback is important. We want to hear very specific feedback. You can edit features and create features. And then if you maintain information, like I mentioned earlier, you can actually contribute that information, and those layers will get sewn into the other maps. Now, in terms of how it works behind the scenes, this is kind of an interesting concept. I think it's important to kind of talk about the different sources that go into Esri's base maps. Now, we have some licensed data, some commercial data that we use as kind of like the foundation. So it covers most of the world. And then where we improve information, we will exchange it or basically append it or integrate it with community data. And of course, we have data from our editor app. We have data that comes in from our feedback services. All of those get integrated with a series of tools and processes that my team and others work on. That data then ultimately ends up in a central database. And this is a huge database. We work on this global scale, but it's basically a large scale database of the world with over 1 billion features. Then every 3 weeks, we take a copy of that data, and as it sits at that 3-week period, and over a series of a couple weeks, we reproduce the world basemaps, the Esri vector basemaps. So there's always data coming in from different commercial vendors, always data coming in from communities, edits coming in all the time from feedback in the editor app. And so every 3 weeks, we turn around a new basemap, and with those updates. So I'll go through the 3 bubbles with a little more detail and kind of give a little, some examples on this. And I'll start with feedback. Now, feedback is very important, and it has been growing. Obviously, people are looking at our maps. And so getting the feedback in is basically a way of us at Esri getting information to either our commercial vendors for their data, or even some of our other customers with their data if there's been a misspelling or something incorrect. And that's kind of what we look for with this type of feedback, is very specific. We don't want very broad general things like, hey, things are wrong over here. We see that a lot. What we want are things that are very detailed. Like this example is, there's a road that actually takes this bend, and in real life, it does not take that bend. And so the feedback is saying, hey, fix this road. Another example is just a misspelling. And sometimes this could be, enough of a problem with, people finding their streets or their locations. And so we want to make sure that we're feeling those type of errors. Again, specific type of errors. Now I'm going to jump over the editor app and talk about sharing data, and then I'll go back to the editor app. And the first thing that someone does when they want to share their layers is they register. And this is a very simple process. They just tell us who they are, a little bit of information about their organization, where they are. It's kind of like an area of interest or almost like a data stewardship boundary. And then what layers you want to participate, what layers that you want to contribute. These could be very generic base map type layers, parks, streets, parcels, buildings, those type of things. When you get approved from this registration, the next process is to submit your data. And we have evolved this process to include both a file geodatabase, which has been kind of the traditional way of contributing, and also you can contribute your data as a feature service. Now, the idea of a feature service, which is kind of becoming our preferred way, if it makes sense, because it's almost as if it's a subscription. It's almost as if, like, if you've got a feature service of your park layer and you make changes to it, then once or twice a year we'll come by and take a copy of it, and then we'll integrate those updates. And so it's almost like the set it and forget it model. With feature classes in a file geodatabase, we have another way. We actually recommend that our users use a set of data prep tools. The idea of these data prep tools are, we don't know your data very well. You know your data, the schema and the format of it. These tools are simple geodatabase or geoprocessing conversion tools, and they just ask questions about your data, and the output is a very easy to ingest data model for my team. Now, when you send your data as layers like this, there is a little bit of a commitment. We want the map to be up to date, and we hope that there is a a responsibility that, or even a commitment from the organizations to send their data once or twice a year. And so there can be more frequent updates as things change in the world, but we kind of feel with most of the layers, once or twice a year can really be important. So I kind of skipped over the editor app at first, and I wanted to do that on purpose because for a while, before a couple of years ago, all you could do is contribute your data or give us feedback. And we had a lot of organizations that would write to us and say, you know, hey, could you add some more detail in this area, whether it was a university campus or a park or something like that. And they didn't want to do that in feedback because you really can't give that kind of detail in feedback. And they did not have the data. You know, these were layers that they did not maintain. So this is kind of what evolved out of this is a web-based digitizing experience where you log in and you can use the imagery as a base map and you can digitize features on top of it. And there's a couple of reasons why you might do this. We've got, even in the US, we've got some organizations that are doing all three parts of our community maps. They're submitting data layers, they're providing feedback for layers they didn't provide, and then they're also using this editor app to actually go in and add detail. And some of these examples, like for managing school campuses, this could be for facilities management of the grounds. Like we've got a school district that has done all of their schools within their district. It could be that they're doing it for public safety. So it's just the ability to add that level of detail. I know many organizations maintain or at least host some form of like a park locator app. And the park locator or park finder app is really kind of an interesting one for local governments. And we've had a bunch of communities that have used like interns or you know, some summer help. Even I've had my teenagers digitize some stuff with this for their school. And you can go in and do these parks, and you can really bring out the amenities and the facilities that could be used in a handheld mobile app for facilities maintenance and those type of things. And you know, that's really kind of a very positive thing. And of course, there's a lot of room for improving areas around the world that could have been of historical significance, or even some of these big recreation facilities. It could be zoos, it could be Grand Prix circuit maps. It could be some really interesting places. So that's kind of the editor app. Now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to bounce out of this, and I'm going to do a little demonstration within our bubble page. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about feedback. So I clicked on the feedback button, and it opens up an ArcGIS Online group. Now, at the bottom of this group, there are these three items: geocoding feedback, basemap feedback, and imagery feedback. And we've got a little details about how to do each of these. With geocoding, you might report that a geocoding result might have been in the wrong place. And so you could draw a box and say, hey, fix this. And we can do a little research and fix it. With imagery, sometimes we do find anomalies with imagery. We might find some very blurred areas or skewed imagery, and it helps to kind of bring those back to the vendor and get those repaired. But with basemap feedback, you know, we can open up this map and actually zoom in and look at the base map that we were looking at. So what I'm going to do is I've got one specific place that I know of that I'm going to just kind of show how this is done. So if I zoom in to Helena, this is a town in the middle of the United States. And if I switch over to this base map, now the vector base maps are used, the same data is used in most of these maps. So if I switch over to the imagery hybrid, you'll see that there is a street that goes right through the middle of this brand new school. And so obviously this needs to be modified. So in this map, I can actually go and hit the edit, and I can click on an open feature, and this is a new feature that I'm going to add, and I can just draw a box around it. It doesn't need to be too fancy. I can give a little detail about modify this feature. I can put some additional information, maybe some street names might have changed, or even a website for somebody to go and look at. I can tell you what map it's in. It's in all of our vector-based maps, and I can hit add. So that is feedback. That's very specific. It's to the, very surgical edits to the database. Now, in sharing data, I can actually go in and log in to this, what we call our contributor app. Now, the contributor app is where you actually make your contributions. You can look at your account if you wanted to change your point of contact, you wanted to change your layers or some other information. You can look at past contributions. We keep track of all the contributions that people have made. And this is where you'd actually make your contribution. And so if you had data, these are all the layers that I'm specifically registered for. But if I had data as a service, and this is why I wanted to focus on this, that I can actually use like a public facing feature service that is either hosted in ArcGIS Online or it's an enterprise service. It's got to be public facing. But I can go down and let me pick one that I use for some demonstrations, this one here. From those services, I can then pick which layer that I want to contribute. And then you can pick the frequency. This is where I talk about the information being kind of like a subscription, where every 6 months, go ahead and come back to this service every 6 months and take a copy of it and then integrate those, because I'm maintaining this on my side. There's also the ability to do a little bit more refined queries on your information. So if I've got a layer or a label field that I want to include, or if I want to identify whether some of my features are actually education facilities, I could do that. Let me see. If I go code is equal to 2. What we do is we actually save these queries. And so this query will actually get saved into the background of my subscription. So each time the data gets downloaded, it gets downloaded the same way. So those are the parameters that I can download. And if something changes on my account, I can go back into this admin page and actually edit the queries that I set. So that is how data gets to us through the feature service. Now, lastly, I just want to demonstrate just for a few minutes the editor app. Now, I've already opened this group. If you click on the link on the main page, it opens up a group. You do have to join this group, and anybody with an organization account can join the group. And then you can see a few of these items. In the editor app right here, we have a sandbox, and that is actually really helpful for just kind of testing and doing some practice. But we do have the editor app itself. And when I click on that, it opens the app and it has me sign in. It opens to this community style vector base map. And what I'd like to do is show you just a little bit of how this app works. And I found a location that's in Australia. I'm not sure if anybody on the call knows of the Civic Reserve over in Mornington, but I thought that this might be an interesting place. I've gone ahead and added an area of interest, and an area of interest is kind of like the canvas for a painter. Think of this is where I'm going to create my work. Now you have to have an area of interest before you can do anything else. Now at this point, I can switch over to the base map, and I can see that the imagery base map shows that there's quite a bit of detail here, and this could be a really neat enhancement of the base map. So let me show you how this works. First, I click New, and then I can choose from these different templates. And these are the only things that you can add in this editor app. So there's kind of a limit, there's a finite list. One thing I'm going to do first is I'm just going to draw one large grass polygon around the entire thing. And if I just double click, what it'll do is it'll trim it to the edge of my area of interest. And that means I've just planted grass over this whole area. Now, obviously, it's not all grass, but from there, I can actually change the transparency of that so I can see things a little bit better. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. And now I'm going to add a few more features. First, I'm going to add this building. So I go and click building, and I want to demonstrate just a few of the very kind of higher end editing capabilities. So if I click on my space bar, I'm actually going to get some tools that come up. They're called layer hints. You see that? That's a right angle right there. And so it's making me draw in right angles, and which is kind of neat. You know, I'm being very quick with this because of the time that we have. But this is a really interesting way to add features. Let me do that one more time. I have to cut into the grass that's there. So this feature will actually cut the grass, and so that feature will end up being an independent feature from the grass. And when I get done here, I can then even give it some properties. So with that feature selected, I can click on properties. And if I knew that this was the gym, I can go ahead and add that as a label. Now that'll become a property of this feature once it gets into the base map. Then if I wanted to add like this parking lot, I can add that here by clicking hardscape parking lot. I'm doing this quick, but again, the idea is that, you know, someone would really take their time. Here's another capability I'm going to show is that I can actually use a curve to do some of these lines. And so like this, so that feature is now there, a parking lot. Now, the last thing I want to demonstrate is how I can actually do another thing. I can select this grass, which is the large feature behind it. And instead of drawing something on top, oftentimes I like to cut it. I like to split it and then change the properties. Watch what I do here. I hit split and I draw the outline of this track. And I'm going to do this quick, but you know, pay attention to kind of what I'm doing here is I'm going to draw the outline of this, but I'm not really drawing a feature on top so much. I'm actually just cutting this grass, big, large grass polygon into a smaller piece. And then I can select it like this, and it's still grass, but I can actually change it to sports athletic track. So that's just another kind of tip. I could do that for many of these locations, and that's kind of a way of really being efficient in this application. Now, if I just switch back to the app here, you can see I'm starting to build my map. And eventually, if I have put enough time into this, we can get some detailed locations. Like this is a regional park that's in the United States. A lot of detail that was added to the parking area, some of the amphitheater. It really just adds to that level of detail. And of course, just one last example is some sporting facilities, you know, with a lot of the soccer fields and those type of things. This, with the right amount of time, can be very powerful and a lot of detail. All right, so I have talked quite a bit, and so what I'd like to do is send this back over to Simon. And Simon, I think you were going to share some local examples, and then we'll have time for some Q&A.
Yeah, cheers, Seth. That was great. I just wanted to, before we get to the Q&A, just make you aware that there's already a lot of valuable content in the Esri Basemaps within Australia, and this is really made possible by the existing contributions from the Esri community. So just a big shout out and a big thank you to the organisations from both local, state and federal that have contributed content into the various layers within the Esri Basemaps. Just to pick on a couple of those, down here in Victoria, DELP, they've recently contributed a large range of layers to align the Esri Basemaps to the great content from the VicMap as a service services. There's also some discussion on setting up syncs that we were looking at there between the live feature services and the Esri Basemaps. Over in Tassie, Land Tasmania have also, currently there's parcels, but there's a current contribution that's just going through the queue with national parks, sports fields, and I believe, Seth, that's going to be released, what's the date-ish?
I believe on the 13th of October is the date that okay. One's being released. Yep.
Cool. And there'll be a second contribution for Tassie as well. Actually, it'll have some more detailed information around piers and docks, maybe even updating the coastline of Tasmania, water bodies and estuaries. Another one up in Queensland. So it's probably the biggest contribution we've had from a combination of Department of Resources and also Queensland Parks and Wildlife. Again, national parks, state parks, the coastline, water features, estuaries, sports facilities, swamps. Yeah, that was a really big one. And there's a lot of councils, such as Moreton Bay, that have contributed really rich data sets. Like they submitted their cricket ovals, but even like the line work on the sports fields, trees, buildings. And this really makes the base map come alive when you start to get to those lower scale levels. So we put together a range of resources to learn more about community basemaps. We've collated these for you onto a single page. This will include a link to our blog, which also lets you keep up to date with Australian contributions. The link's on the slide here. We'll throw a link in the chat as well, and we'll also send a link to this page in our post-webinar email. But I do encourage you to subscribe to our blog. That's where we kind of advertise the upcoming contributions that are happening. There is still time to submit your questions. So if you go to the GoToWebinar panel, on the right-hand side, there's a little Q&A button that you can click on. Let's have a look. What have we got in here? So there's a few questions, but I might just jump into one of my own actually very quickly, Seth. Like I understand there's all these contributions, they're really valuable, but in Australia, I know that one of the key data sets that feeds a lot of the base map is the HERE data, which I know is a commercial data set. Can you tell us a little bit more about how often that's updated and the kind of current vintage?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question, and I showed in that one slide that kind of showed the how it works workflow a little bit, that commercial data is really the foundation. It's what starts, before many of our contributors come in. And currently we use HERE as our commercial provider, and over the last couple of years we have really increased the frequency that we receive from HERE and that we load in. It used to be that it was once a year, and this year we've been loading for Australia the data every quarter that we get. And actually what's live today in the vector base maps is the Q3 2021 data for HERE. So it's very up to date. I hope that is very valuable and useful for sure.
Cool, thanks. There's a few questions actually that have just popped up around OpenStreetMap data. So I'll try and split them into two questions.
Okay.
I guess the first one being, is there a way to make the data, like, so let's say you make a contribution, is there a way to make that data available to other providers like OpenStreetMap, like kind of pushing it out to OpenStreetMap?
Yeah, that's been coming up a lot. In fact, that's been a great question. And so last summer we opened up a new functionality when you register to submit your data to Esri. We asked like kind of two questions, like we want you to give us permission to use it in our base maps, and you don't have to share it outside. You don't have to let it be distributable. Or we're now allowing you to be able to let us share it with partners like OpenStreetMap. And so we're making this data available that we're collecting. So so far we've got a couple of hundred of organizations around the world that have asked to make this information available to OpenStreetMap, and we are letting it be available to users of OpenStreetMap, some specific users, to add in. So there is a little bit of a process to getting the information directly in. Obviously, if there's information already in OpenStreetMap, there's some conflict detection that goes in. But we have definitely been filling in a lot of these areas like buildings and some of those type of things with data from our communities into the OpenStreetMap. Yeah.
So I guess the flip side to that question mainly from Stephen and Todd here is, what about the other way? Like, does Esri ingest some of the OpenStreetMap data into the alongside the HERE data, or?
Yeah. So in fact, this is something we've just recently been doing, is using some OpenStreetMap data. Now, we've always used OpenStreetMap data in areas where we didn't have any data, like in some parts of Africa and Asia. There are some areas that HERE does not have good content, and so we've used OpenStreetMap to supplement that. Now, what we started to do is look at some of the detail that OpenStreetMap has acquired in developed areas, and areas that maybe HERE doesn't have as much detail. And we've looked at taking certain elements of the layers and porting those into our maps. And we don't blend the information, because that's against the OpenStreetMap kind of licensing terms. But we do use it independently into our databases, and then it gets used into our base maps. And it has been very valuable. In fact, in the United States, there's been a project just recently over the summer to increase a lot of our building footprints in areas with OpenStreetMap. So we're looking at expanding that into more areas. Good question.
And one last question, which from Craig. So can the building footprints be given a high attribute for use in 3D scenes? I think we're okay in saying this, is that yourself and me, Seth, we've talked about essentially the OpenStreetMap buildings, and should we or shouldn't we use those in the Esri Basemaps for Australia? There is a flavor that's the daylight version,
Yep.
which we can send
Yep.
a link to. But then we're also working with Geoscape to try and get those buildings into the Esri Basemaps as well. So that's something that might be of interest.
Yeah, and there has been conversation about, you know, a community 3D base map, and it hasn't been formalized whatsoever. But certainly because, you know, that kind of information is becoming more readily available. In fact, right now when we accept building footprints, we ask if there is information about height, you know, like number of stories or number of floors or the height of the building. And it's information that we do actually or can pass that on to OpenStreetMap, because that is an attribute that they ask for. At this time, we haven't necessarily done any sort of extruding of those features to kind of create 3D scenes yet, but we know it's coming. Yep, I think that we can all see that everybody's going 3D, so for sure.
Joel has a couple of questions. I'll start, actually, there's a few questions around accuracy and conflict. So to summarize Joel's question, can you talk about the accuracy of, you know, if I want to contribute some data, what sort of accuracy does it need to be before it kind of gets through the, you know, the various bars and gets into the actual Esri Basemaps?
Yeah, so accuracy is an interesting question, because, you know, it is a little bit relative, obviously. You know, and I mentioned before, there's parts of the world where we're missing features altogether, and so sometimes the best available information that we get isn't necessarily perfect. You know, it's not survey grade, and so something's better than nothing. We've always had that approach. But when it comes down to looking at like two different sources of information that might be representing the same features, if we had conflicting information from a city and a county or a state, we might have to do a little reconciliation or review against some imagery. You know, there really aren't any standards that we've determined. Like, we don't state that it's got to be within a certain accuracy necessarily. I know that accuracy levels in imagery are sometimes terms that vendors can provide, but, you know, we're really not looking at giving any sort of grades to those type of things. So usually what we're doing is making sure that the data works well together. Simon, you and I have seen where you mix some very poor resolution water bodies with some, you know, some roads. You might get some roads that actually go into the water. So sometimes we have to do a little cleanup on those type of things.
Jeff just raised a really good question that I think we can talk around the process. So does the correction data that's collected into Esri, so if I make that road example, if we sort of say, look, here's a road, we think it's in the wrong place, how does that also get fed across to here for the here to sort of update their roads?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we look at the data that's being questioned, you know, if it's a park name or if it's a road, first thing that my team will do is actually find out where that data piece came from. And if it is an OpenStreetMap feature in some of these areas, because we have had feedback about features in OpenStreetMap, we actually will then go back to OpenStreetMap and fix it, and so that it will come back around as another update. If it's a here feature, we have a direct relationship with here that we can feed these elements of feedback, and then they can come back in a subsequent update to us.
What about, there's a couple of questions around conflict. So if I'm a local council and I've contributed my data set and it overlaps with maybe a state or a federal agency data set, I guess rivers might be a common one. I know the states have a version and the feds have a version. How do you kind of work out who wins?
Yeah, no, that happens all the time. We have what we call a nested contributor, where even real close to where I'm at, we have a university, we have a city, we have a county, and then we have a state. So we have all these different levels, and some of them have different levels of accuracy, or the data might be less up to date than others. And so oftentimes the smaller geography sometimes wins. Like that, we've seen that in many places. A university might have very accurate survey grade from like a CAD drawing, building footprints and polygons that represent. The city may not have data to that degree of accuracy. They may have received something that was machine learned derived, and in this, the county might have something that was even less. So we usually will cut a hole in the data and actually integrate it that way, or we do it by detection, by conflict detection. If features touch each other, then we deconflict those features. But certainly what we have done in the past also in those very same situations is we've got on the phone with both organizations and we said, okay, where did your buildings come from or your water bodies? What about yours? And sometimes they will say, yeah, that data is actually the same. We get it from the same vendor. We get it from the same source. And so in those cases, we might say, well, let's not use the city's data if the county's data is exactly the same. Like let's work on those type of things at a layer by layer basis. And so conflict detection is big. We definitely don't do it with any sort of degree of expertise, like in terms of like we know which source is better. We'll review it and we'll ask questions about it. And sometimes those type of conflicts just need to be done between the organizations, in fact. And Esri can sort of be the mediator a little bit, but that's kind of how we've dealt with those in the past.
And that's actively happening now. So there's a particular state where there's some debate over the roads from the transport agency versus the land agency versus the commercial provider, and which one's kind of the more accurate in rural versus metro. And yeah, so I guess Esri Australia kind of acts as a bit of a broker there to try and bring those people together, and that's kind of a good example of a local one. Another question I've got, I might be able to help out on this one from Julie, is around who's actually using the base maps and the data. I've just pulled up the usage stats for the last month. So Dial Before You Dig is one of the big ones, Queensland Globe, the Geoscience Australia Elvis platform, the Geoscience Australia Earthquake platform, which I'm guessing is going to be further up in the charts next month. ACT Gov have it. I can see there's a couple of apps to some of the nearby maps for New South Wales. They put some of those what's within my 5K perimeter apps or 10Ks, and that's been popular. Yeah, it's a wide range of public apps. As Seth mentioned, it's commonly the imagery and the topographic base maps, but we can also see a lot of usage in ArcGIS Pro and in ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise with private apps, and we might be able to include a summary of some of those apps in the takeaway notes if required. Let's have a look what else we got in here. Seth, do you know much about the imagery? Like I know there's a few providers of imagery in Australia, but how often, the vector-based maps you mentioned is a 3-week kind of cycle that kind of they get pumped out depending on the contributions coming in. What about imagery? Do you know much about how often that gets updated?
I'm not an expert on that. I do know that there is a group that manages the imagery from various commercial agencies. Again, commercial data versus the community data. We have dozens of organizations that provide imagery annually to us. Like they get a flight done and they'll send that information to us. On a commercial basis, it probably is done in piecemeal. It's probably done in urban areas more than rural areas. It might be also done based on demand. And so, certainly we're trying to find, areas that are needing some updates, and we can always put a little bit of influence on those type of things. And so I don't know exactly the cycle that they have with Maxar and those type of commercial providers, but I know that it is an active process for sure.
I guess just it's not quite answering the question, but the elevation data that you mentioned earlier, Seth, we do have so Geoscience Australia and their Elvis platform where all the elevation data is. The elevation team at Esri, we have a copy of that content in the Esri elevation services as well.
Right,
and for the address data, Seth mentioned that there's the GNAF data set is updated at least once, but historically it's been twice a year into the Esri geocoding services, which is useful. I think we've got time for one more question. Let's have a look. What have we got? Quite a few left. Any of the questions that we haven't got to, we will get back to you. There is quite a few in here. Let's have a look. This is a good one. So Todd asks, is there a capability for dual names for streets areas? So having like a a local name, but also maybe a different language name or an Aboriginal name. Is that something that,
Oh,
assuming
that's
the data
interesting.
exists, that we could account for? Or
Yeah, so there is a lot to do with translations recently in the vector base maps. The raster base maps were so different that we had because they were just pictures, but the vector base maps, we can have different local languages.
Mhm.
And if there's not a language that's there yet, it's something that we can always look into. It is the ability there are some groups, and that's something I can actually provide to you, Simon, as another link, is a series of groups that have the same vector base maps with the local language that's available. Now, if that local language is not part of what the data has right now, that's another process in and of itself, is getting things translated, or getting names in other languages. But that is a big part of the vector base maps, is that in parts of the world where they want to see it in their language, they want to see many things, not just their country. They want to see every place in their language. That the vector base maps have that capability of having the local language or a specific language turned on. I think there's about 34 languages at this point that it's been, many of the features have been translated into, not every feature, but many of the features. And then obviously if that data is available locally, then that local version of the vector base map actually will show some of those alternative names like that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of more flexibility in this now, and we just have to make sure that the data supports it.
so there's a few people on the call that seems to resonate with. I think I'll set up a spin-off conversation around that and what we want to do for Australia there.
We'd be very interested in that.
I think with that, we've probably got to wrap up. So, Seth, thanks very much for. I know it's quite late in your evening, so thanks very much for dialing in and helping out.
No problem. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, guys.
And those that ask questions that haven't had answers, we will get back to you. It might be next Monday, but we will get back to you. I'll pass it back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Simon and Seth. That was a great presentation, Seth, but also a great discussion and lots of great questions. So really appreciate having you both with us today. Now, just a reminder that we have recorded the session today, and a link to the recording, plus any of the resources that we included, will be sent out in a post webinar email, and that will hit your inbox early next week. But before then, there's a lot to catch up on. So make sure you check out the latest episode of the GIS Directions podcast. So Simon Jackson is joining Tara and Joss this time round, and they're exploring the art of sharing intuitive, targeted mapping products out with the world. So definitely worth listening into. And of course, please head to our webinar page. So there you can catch up on any of our past webinars, including our recent series around migrating to ArcGIS Pro. So they're all available now. And you can also subscribe to our GIS Directions newsletter to be in the know on what will be coming up next. And we do have a few things in store, so do sign up. But for now, thank you again for joining us. We really do love your feedback and suggestions on what you'd like to see on the webinar series. So take the time, if you can, to fill out the brief survey that will pop up at the end of the session. And of course, as always, you can reach out to us directly at events@esriaustralia.com.au. But for now, have a great day and thanks for joining us.